Okay, everybody. Good morning. The only hard part about this morning was going to be to get the energy tone down just a little bit to get started. I mean, this is just fabulous. We're so glad to have you all here. Thank you very much for coming. My name's John Hamry. I'm the president of CSIS. I have the great advantage of standing up here and pretending to be responsible here and taking credit for good things that happen. And so this is wonderful. And I want to say thanks to my friends here at CSIS, especially Johanna Nesseth and Dan Rundy for pulling together this event. And special thanks to our friends at Chevron that are making possible our opportunity to present the development agenda to Washington. And we want to present it in a new way. We think that there's a bitter debate going on in America about development, but it's off on the wrong track. You know, because what we're all after is healthier people, healthier communities, healthier societies, healthier countries. That's something that could unify everyone. That isn't something that should divide America. That should be something that unites America. And that's our purpose for this. I want to say thank you to our friends making this possible at Chevron. We should say a hearty welcome to the staff of USAID. They are right now at the Reagan Center on a podcast watching all of us, and they want to know what their bosses are going to be saying. And so we want to say thank you to them for joining us today. I was a government employee for 25 years, and I want to say how proud I am that they're still willing to serve, and we really do need to. So give them a round of applause. That's our friends at AID. And let me say a great welcome to our friend Aaron Williams, who heads up the Peace Corps, and we're delighted he's here. You know, this of course is the 50th anniversary for the Peace Corps and the 50th anniversary for USAID. And oh, by the way, the 50th anniversary for CSIS. I'm not exactly sure how we were lucky enough to get in that good company, but we are front end of celebrating our anniversary as well. And you know, when you mark anniversaries, you know, there's a terrible tendency for it just to be about nostalgia. That's not the reason that we mark anniversaries. We look back in order to inform ourselves about what we are, what we're trying to do, what's important to us. And of course, back in 1961, it's hard for us to remember. About half of the room here wasn't born then. So let me just refresh your memory. Back in 1962, there were two contending, blocks in the world, and there was the democratic, liberal, Western-oriented bloc that believed in rule of law and participatory pluralistic society, and there was a mobilization authority bloc that had a different construct on how to organize the world. And it wasn't clear in 1962 how that was going to play out. You know, it was only 4 years after Sputnik when we were shocked. We didn't know how it was going to end. We knew what we needed to do. We weren't going to win the Cold War by having a larger army. We were only going to win by having better ideas, and ideas that the world wanted. And that was the starting point of AID. That was the starting point of the Peace Corps. Presenting to the world superior ideas, ideas that by themselves would draw support and be winning ideas for the world. And it was a huge and important part of the success of our grand strategy. Now we're in a new time, in some ways a far more difficult time, a more challenging time. But I would argue it probably is one that it makes it more important for the United States to be a progressive and constructive leader in developing healthier people, healthier communities, healthier countries. That's what this is about. Now to commemorate that, it's a series that we're going to have, and nothing could be better than starting it with this event. And I want to say special thanks to the USAID administrators that have chosen to be with us today. Peter McPherson, of course, was the pioneer that brought food into the agenda and did such pioneering work at that time. Andrew Natsios, who has been just a champion for development and indefatigable. And we've been very grateful for that service. Henrietta Fore. Now, Henrietta is also one of my bosses, I should tell you. So I have to say very glowing things about Henrietta. But I just admire her so deeply. And she did such important work to bring the public-private partnership dimension to AID. And of course, Dr. Rajiv Shah, who is now leading USAID through challenging times, but with enormous energy and conviction. And so we're lucky to have them here, and I'm going to get off the stage, but I do want to say thank you to all of you for coming. Thank you to our USAID friends who are watching us remotely. And let me turn to you, Dan. Why don't you get this going for real? Thank you all.
Thanks, Dr. Hamre. Thanks, everybody. A special welcome to our friends at USAID who are watching in the Point 4 conference room. This is the Chevron Forum here at CSIS. It's USAID at 50. And we have a lot to celebrate, a lot to look back on. When I think about USAID, I think about service and I think about sacrifice. And I think about people like Holly Wise, my first boss, who was a Foreign Service officer. I think about innovators like Jim Thompson, a great civil servant. I think about great Foreign Service nationals like Denis Karepanov, others who went on to become prime ministers or cabinet members of their countries. There's just thousands and thousands of people who have lived in some of the world's most difficult places and are under very challenging circumstances. But I also think about accomplishments like the Green Revolution, accomplishments like freeing hundreds of millions of people from dictatorships and helping to bring prosperity to the world. So it's a record of accomplishment and a record of also looking back on service and sacrifice. We also are here at a moment of great challenge. I think we'll have a chance to talk about that as well. I think the folks to my left don't really need an introduction in this audience, either here or in the watching over the internet. I'll just briefly mention who each of them are, but you have their biographies in front of you. To my immediate left is Peter McPherson, who was an aid administrator in the Reagan administration, Andrew Natsios, who was aid administrator under George Bush 43, and then Ms. Henrietta Fore, who was also aid administrator under Bush 43, and now Dr. Rajiv Shah, the current aid administrator under President Barack Obama. I think we have an opportunity to talk about, we're going to talk about several things. We're going to talk about accomplishments, we're going to talk about sectors, programmatic sectors, and then we're going to talk about the issues and challenges outside of the Ronald Reagan building is, I guess, perhaps a way to describe the third area that we're going to talk about. So I want to, before I begin though, I just want to just also reference the fact that at CSIS we have any number of different programs here on international development, and we have a whole series of alums from USAID who are with us at CSIS, including Jerry Hyman and Joanna Mendelsohn Foreman and Ambassador Bill Garvelank and Steve Morrison, among many others. So it's we come to this conversation with a lot of heft and experience to this discussion. So let me get into the first question that I've prepared for each of the former administrators and the current administrator. The first question is about accomplishments. Since we're here for an anniversary, want us to think back and look at what are either it's your time as administrator, but also in the longer arc of history, what are some of the accomplishments or a particular accomplishment that we should be thinking about when we think about 50 years of USAID service and sacrifice? I'm going to start first with Mr. McPherson.
Well, thank you. It's good to be here. It's good to have Aaron Williams, who was an AID leader back when I was there, 50th anniversary of the Peace Corps, attending as well today. There were so many wonderful people and great projects. It's hard to narrow the list down. I think of Earth College in Costa Rica. I think of the sewer and water system in Cairo and Alexandria and so forth. But let me go to three global efforts. Not necessarily in order of importance, all were big impact. The oral rehydration therapy, which we had 1,000 people in a conference here in Washington, working with Jim Grant at UNICEF, that grand old man of development. And after consulting and working it through, we announced we were going to save 2 million lives a year per year in 3 years. Just a tremendous effort. It was a magical thing, and it pulled along so much health. Next, the famine effort in 84, 85, one of the historical huge efforts. And an interesting part of that was Ethiopia and Mozambique were one of the hardest hit areas. They were both communist regimes, particularly hardline with Ethiopia. A debate within the administration. Remember, we're now in the middle of, or in a very intense period of the Cold War. And I recall so well taking the pictures in to see the president, and and telling him about my trip, and Senator Danforth had been key before all this, by the way, and the president saying, a hungry child has no politics. And I came out and said that's what the president had said. Andrew remembers all this. And we, that was a defining moment in U.S. humanitarian effort by all administrations since. I saw his quote in The Economist here 6 months ago again. A hungry child knows no politics. Family planning. Now, family planning is diminished in its profile because so much was achieved. It's not all done, but it's big. International Planned Parenthood put posters in the back of buses saying I was killing women because I didn't fund abortions. Some people on the right said I was pro-abortion because I support IUDs. Push and pull on all sides, but there was more family planning money during the Reagan years than all combined administrations. The president was supportive. Just don't do abortion, Peter, and I'll be there. The economic policies, we were a key part of this. Farm gate prices, exchange rates. I'm so very proud of the people I worked with during those years. It was a real pleasure.
Thank you. Mr. Natsios.
Well, just an extension on your family planning. The one area that I contributed to was to revise the formula for the distribution, because the health money is distributed based on mathematical formulas of infectious disease rate. It's peer reviewed every year. When people say, how do you give out the money? I said, there are actual scientific ways in which a lot of the science-based programs are distributed. But I said, is there a part of the formula that looks at arable land per capita in an agricultural society? Because food insecurity is affected by this. And Ethiopia has very high fertility rates. 80 million people. It's the second largest country in Africa, and we keep having food emergencies every 2 years, and we have to go in with massive amounts of food aid. So I said, revise the formula. We want more family planning money. We went from 2 million, I think, to 22 million
Andrew,
the first year.
just want to make sure, do you have your microphone on?
Sorry, I don't. You want me to start over again? No.
No, it's okay.
But do the 2 million to 22 million again.
Pardon me?
The 2 million to 22 million.
Well, we
That's
went
it.
from $2 million to $22 million in family planning. We had yelling matches over this because they didn't want to change the formula initially. And I just got a note from the former director, she's retired now, of the family planning program. And she said, Andrew, these are the most extraordinary results, because we can mathematically track this. This is the largest improvement we've ever seen in any country in that short a period of time in the prevalence in the use of family planning among rural Ethiopians, where this problem of food insecurity is most severe. It increased from 14% to 28% over a 5-year period, and then in the cities it's gone up even more, and that's just the beginning. So it has even an effect now. Now we had to take money out of Asia, where the program had been around for 30 years, but into a country where we had a very small program. So it does work, Peter, and I'm very proud of that, because we also did, on the same way, an agriculture program in Ethiopia and an economic growth program. And if you look, we started that in 2003. I had 7 hours of conversations with the Prime Minister, Meles Zenawi, I've known for many years. And I said, you know, you've had a 50% drop in your GDP while you've been in office, and it's not helping your government. If you look at the rates of growth since we started that, they've been 8 to 12% annual growth rates in Ethiopia. Their economy is booming. Now, the last thing I want to show, though, or mention, is the thing I'm most proud of that is not well known, and that is the Democracy and Governance Program, which was started by Peter McPherson. It was Ronald Reagan who started it, started in '85, and Jerry Hyman, who I made the head of the Democracy and Governance Program in AID, and he said, Andrew, we need empirical evidence that this is working. So let's do a worldwide 20-year retrospective and correlate the results. Look at from 1985 to 2005 and see what the effect is, and use the Freedom House Index of Democracy and Governance and Human Rights as the quantitative measurement if there's been an improvement in the country. This is what the study shows. This was done, by the way, not by AID, but by Vanderbilt University, University of Pittsburgh, and later we got the National Academy of Sciences involved. This is not an AID internal evaluation. Let me read it what it says. The study found that for every $10 million additional dollars of U.S. democracy assistance in 1985 dollars, a country is predicted to have a 0.25 unit improvement in the Freedom House General Democracy and Governance Index. High correlation level, robust correlation is the term used in the study. The most interesting thing is that it takes 10 years for these to have an effect. And the effect takes place after you stop the program. Many of our programs in the whole development community have problems with sustainability. These programs show the result after you stop the program, there's no more funding. And what the study also showed is continuing improvements after, several years after that. So there's a lag effect. So one of the problems we have is people in this city, it's an American trait, they want immediate results, quantitative every quarter. That's not the way development works. It didn't work in the United States that way. In the early republic, do you think we had quarterly measurements for George Washington and Alexander Hamilton in the first 8 years of the republic? Of course not. But it worked in the United States, and it worked in the developing world, and this study shows that. Now, every administration has increased the democracy budget. I'm very proud of that. Republican and Democratic alike. Brian Atwood doubled spending on this. We doubled it again, and it's doubled again. Too much of it's just in Afghanistan and Pakistan. I think it needs to be spread out more around the world. But this is evidence that these programs work. And the best aid agency in the world for these programs is AID.
Thank you. Ms. Fore.
Thank you. Well, building on these two, when I was administrator, we had a food crisis, and it was mostly about food prices. And by that time, we had lost much of our funding for economic growth, which in turn funds agricultural projects and programs. And so we began developing a program for the administration, for the world, that would be based around smallholder farmers and what they could do to increase their livelihoods. And it was an extraordinary time for USAID. We put together this program for food. We were the first country to announce. It was the largest. It was effective. We remembered how to do things. We picked up all of the good ideas that came out of prior administrations, and USAID began to lead, and it began to change the tide on food prices. We also picked up on the good ideas that had happened before on public-private partnerships, and so we endeavored to triple the number of public-private partnerships that we had. I think it's an area we could still do a great deal on, but it allowed us to put much of our private sector to work in the supply chains of all sorts of problems that you have heard from Peter and Andrew. We also really began to get traction on education programs in Africa, on the enormous health programs that we had moving on HIV/AIDS, on malaria, and all of these had begun earlier. It's to Andrew's point about long-term development, but they were exceedingly important. And then we also focused internally on two areas. One is that we would move the center of gravity for our programs to the field. So we began trying to do country-based budgeting, trying to do it across agencies, that we would base our development programs around the country's development programs so that we would be reinforcing their own desires of how to grow and develop their country. And we started the Development Leadership Initiative, a very important staffing program for Foreign Service officers so that there could be more Americans in the field doing these types of work. And with that came our intellectual leadership. So it became a change in how we looked at ourselves, in how other countries looked at us, in how our own Congress looked at us, and what we could deliver as results around the world. So it was a results-based approach to development.
Dr. Shah.
Well, I would just say when you take a results-based approach to development, as Henrietta mentioned, almost all of the results you have the luxury to discuss really accrue back to your predecessors and the wonderful people at the agency that were there during their time. So I'm not going to introduce new results here, but I want to highlight that when Peter talks about oral rehydration solution, that wasn't just one technical insight. It was a concept that if you could take the power of saving a child's life out of the hands of a medical professional in a hospital and put it in the hands of a mother in a community, you will change your scale from affecting hundreds of thousands of kids to millions and millions and tens of millions of kids. And if you look at the pathway of child mortality across my three predecessors, and if you look across that one insight and what that has meant for that entire field of global health, it's just been absolutely transformational. When Andrew talks about the democratic governance work and the studies that come from it, I'm thinking of what was just in the news a few days ago, where programs that you all put in place, supported, and continue on today helped ensure that Tunisia was able to have an effective election process with more than 90% voter turnout, with more than 60 civil society organizations being part of regional networks as a result of USAID programming being relevant and active within weeks of the political transformation there, and with more than 70 USAID-supported election observers helping to ensure an international result that has credibility. And I talk a lot about food and health. Everyone here has probably heard me talk about our malaria results and our global food security programs and how important and relevant they are. They both started under Henrietta Fore, and we simply wouldn't have the results that we use today to talk about why this work is so important to the American people if it weren't for the leadership that Henrietta showed in those two specific areas. And the results are unbelievable. We're now moving 18 million people out of poverty and hunger, and the PMI program has saved more than 220,000 children under the age of 5 and demonstrated that malaria control is up in the top 2 or 3 things we can do globally to save a child's life at a level of cost effectiveness. So nothing new, but it is all connected. And I think more so than maybe any other area of public policy, our ability to honor and recognize and take forward the efforts of our predecessors in development is critical to achieving long-term results.
Let's shift gears and talk about sectors, but building on this conversation. So, Mr. McPherson, it's impossible to talk about your time as aid administrator without talking about food security and agriculture. Could you talk a little bit more about, you talked a little bit about the famine, and you also then had a post-administrator life at creating the Partnership to Cut Hunger in Africa. You were president of Michigan State University. You're a known quantity, I think, is probably a fair way to describe it in the food security world and the agriculture world. Could you talk a little bit about other takeaways that you had from your time as aid administrator on food security and agriculture and bring it forward to today?
One quick comment, follow up on what Raj has said.
Just make sure your microphone is on.
Is that we build on who came before us, and AID's leadership and effort on all this has been bipartisan. We happen to be 3 Republicans up here, but Brian Atwood, I think, is on a film someplace.
Yes, you will be hearing from Brian Atwood shortly.
And
that's
in
right.
fact, I've told Raj the other day, right after I became administrator, I had all the former administrators that were alive together for a big platform, including Ervo Harriman, who had been a predecessor agency head. That wasn't long before he passed away. This has been a bipartisan effort, and that's important to keep it that way, because these are human issues, not political issues. As to food security, we had pretty good ag budgets through the 80s. And AID had established we're clearly the global leader on ag, along with the World Bank. But as we dropped back from that effort, so too did most of the bilateral agencies. Andrew and Henrietta fought hard for these things, but we didn't really get it back to where we wanted by a long way. I think that President Obama and Raj are particularly to be complimented for the Feed the Future. I'm a huge component of this. Now, the food price spike helped propel all this, but the president really grabbed hold of this, and we need to make this work. We need to sustain it. We we've got, for 20 years or more, we had a long-term global trend of prices, world food prices going down. Almost certainly, we're going to have a global trend up. We need to double the production of food between now and 2050. That's not that many years in the scheme of things. Energy prices are going to go up. Water is going to be more scarce. We got carbon footprint issues. How are we going to double world food prices, world food production over these 40 plus years? It's going to be hard, and it's going to take R&D. It's going to take a lot of things. And Raj, thank you for what you're doing.
Ms. Fore, perhaps this is a moment to ask about the issue of how AID can support private enterprise and private sector-led growth, given that if we're going to have to double agricultural productivity, a lot of that's going to come from the private sector. And you've been a leader on private enterprise development for a very long time. And so I'd appreciate your views on how AID can contribute to private sector-led growth.
Thank you. Peter makes a very good point about Feed the Future initiative. One of the things that strikes you on the food issues is that it is a solvable problem. And the Green Revolution, I think, really began to bring us to that point. And as you look at it, you realize that there is enough food that is grown in the world if you can just get it to the right place at the right time, and then, of course, at a good price. And that is one of the challenges of development. It's to address problems that are solvable. And the private sector is enormously helpful and powerful in this because they carry so many skills and technologies and ways to move ideas into reality and get them out to the smallest person in a community. And that is a powerful partner to have on your side. And in this, the private sector is everyone from for-profit businesses to nonprofit organizations to academic organizations. And in the partnership on the government side, it is local governments as well as the federal government. And so these public-private partnerships, I think, have an enormous opportunity for the future. When I first came into USAID, I ran the Private Enterprise Bureau. And it was a time in USAID when we were privatizing companies because they were state-owned enterprises and governments had run out of money. This will sound familiar to you. And as a result, they were divesting, and we were looking for broad-based economic growth so that everyone could have a stake in their country's economic future. We also began starting stock markets, and we started partnerships that were addressed for the environment, US-Asia Environmental Partnerships and others that were focused on how partnerships could solve many of the problems of poverty. And it became a quest that let you think about what's in it for Americans and American citizens. And when you are able to bring back economic benefits to home, you realize that this is not only important for the countries, but it's important for us here. So that the growth in Eastern and Central Europe, the growth that has occurred since that time, 20-some years ago, has brought a great deal of prosperity. And when you look at companies and jobs in America today, so many of them are depending on consumers in the developing world. And it is that economic growth, those public-private partnerships, that have been the most important area. I think it is, back to Andrew's point that he made earlier, it's one of those little-known areas that carries an enormous impact. It's thrifty, you leverage money, and it has great potential at home. It builds peaceful and prosperous societies. So I think the private sector is a natural partner for all government programs.
Okay. I'm going to come now to Dr. Shah. I have two questions for you, and then I will come to Mr. Natsios to wrap up this round. You came into office, and one of your signature areas has been a focus on innovation and science and technology with the belief, and I think shared in this room, that if we can make important changes or achievements in technology or in innovation, that we can solve some of the problems that we face in development. Could you talk a little bit about that? Could you elaborate on innovation and science and technology for us?
Sure. Well, many of the things that you were talking about and we've all been talking about have been fundamentally driven by technological innovations that in many cases USAID, its partners, its collaborators, particularly in the university community and in the private sector, have helped create, whether it's an innovative new agricultural supply chain that reaches tens of thousands of Ethiopian chick farmers to produce highly nutritious foods that can be used in food assistance for kids coming out of Somalia right now and urgently needing them, or whether it's technology like parallel vote tabulation done on mobile phones that both reduces the cost of election tabulation and improves the credibility of the numbers. Those types of insights are taking place in these types of programs all around the world. What we really wanted to do is just do a better job of tracking, reporting, and promulgating the most breakthrough innovations that can transform development going forward. And I just believe one of those has been something like mobile banking, where in Haiti right now you have more than 1 million mobile banking transactions that have been completed. And we have such a great opportunity as a platform that exists in more than 80 countries around the world to help be someone who shares that knowledge and that insight. I wanted to say one other thing about Henrietta's point about private sector. I was reading, last week we had a public-private partnership forum and we elevated and are expanding the GDA, the Global Development Alliance that Andrew and Henrietta really championed and that Andrew created. And we also are expanding the Development Credit Authority that has been an incredibly useful tool at getting that kind of leverage and unlocking local capital. As we were preparing for it, I read an article about something we did in Taiwan and then a long time ago. I don't actually know when, but a long time ago, where we were flooding food aid into Taiwan. And during the time, we also made an investment in a local plastics company, small local plastics company. Turns out that's a big international company today that employs 2,100 Americans and is expanding its job creation here at home. And it is, again, it's the point I made earlier that our best results accrue across many generations of leadership at USAID. But if we make these investments in a smart way, we're doing this work as much for our own benefit as we are for others around the world. And I think Andrew and Peter and Henrietta are living proof of that in terms of the way you can correlate some of their decisions to concrete job creation or security improvements that we today get to benefit from.
Let me follow up with one additional sector questions about the global health agenda. I think under President Bush and President Obama, there's been a massive increase in health spending. You're the first medical doctor to be aid administrator. And I think as a result of those investments, there have been significant gains in the health sector. At the same time, they're beginning to see articles in the press about perhaps perception of crowding out of local government spending on health, or perhaps maybe a mismatch in some countries in terms of how we're spending our money. First question is, are we too lopsided in some countries on health? Are we crowding out health? And I guess second is 10 years from now, will we, crowding out local government spending of health, and do you imagine the health portfolio, how will it look 10 years from now? How will that evolve?
You know, I think, again, health is a good example of where we're doing as much as we can to build on our past successes. Sure. Peter mentioned oral rehydration. If you think about community health as a strategy that helps bring the cost down of saving lives, you start to create a cheaper, more sustainable model of health that can be expanded in countries. The Bush administration just did miraculous things in raising the resources for global health. We've been fighting hard to maintain that and fighting hard to make sure that we get more and more synergies across the kinds of programs, whether it's PEPFAR and PMI or the maternal and child health programs that existed previously. And I think we're seeing those things come together and allow us to get more results for the same amount of spending, which is where we need to be able to demonstrate that to the American public over and over and over again today.
Okay. Mr. Natsios, you recently wrote a paper about the rise of the counter-bureaucracy. I think many of you in this audience have read. Certainly the folks watching this on live stream, I'm sure, have read. I think of Samizdat.press in the Soviet Union, where sort of secretive printing and reading of documents. This has been a sort of a bestseller at the World Bank. Other various people have read this all over the world in the development community. I think if you could talk, Mr. Natsios, a little bit about how have we gotten to this place of high level of oversight, and where do we go from here?
Well, we need oversight. The question is the level of it and the amount of it. No one is regulating the regulators. There are 10 oversight committees in the United States Congress that oversee AID. They don't even talk to each other. They fight with each other all the time. They used to tell us to do contradictory things. I said, wait a second. If I do this, I'm going to have my head cut off on the other committee. Do you talk to them? We don't talk to them. Are you kidding? You do this or else. Then the other committee tells you to do the exact opposite. Then we have, on the executive side, we have OMB. We have the GAO is an arm of Congress, but it's a separate arm of Congress. We have the Inspector General's office. Then we have the Inspector General for Iraqi reconstruction, and then the Inspector General for Afghan reconstruction. I don't quite know why you have to have an Inspector General for everything and another Inspector General for Iraq and another. Why on the layer upon layer? And then the F office was created in state with 1,400 measurable indicators of performance for everything. The question is this. No one studied the question of the impact of layer upon layer upon layer. One, on the amount of time that AID officers, in fact, this is, by the way, a problem across the whole federal government. No one has asked the question, what's the cost of this? How much time are we spending complying with the demands of the regulators instead of getting the programs run? By the way, most of this stuff has to do with the implementation of federal acquisition regulations, 2,000 pages. The only thing worse, the IRS regulations, are the FARs. I know procurement officers may like the FARs, but if you're a third world country and you want to bid on something, 2,000 pages of, you can't even read them in English, let alone in a language of another country. You have the Foreign Assistance Act, which is 450 pages long. Then you have the Government Accountability Act that requires all of these levels of program accountability. The effect of this is to depress innovation. Anybody does anything that fails, their career is over. Well, what's the message to career people? Don't experiment, don't innovate. If you do, the counter-bureaucracy will destroy you. The most dysfunctional thing that for a development agency that this system does is the disbursement rates. When we started in Afghanistan, we used to have a meeting with DOD and state every week on how fast we were dispersing funds. I said, I won't tell you who the senior officer was. He's still an aide. I don't want to embarrass him. You'd go to the meeting and we'd start yelling at people. Are you an idiot? We're in a war zone and you want us to disperse the money faster and faster. Well, it's counterproductive to distribute it. It means you're not talking to the people locally. You're not getting local ownership. You're not getting local buy-in. You are not building capacity because the money has to be dispersed immediately. The whole system, by the way, has forced Brian Atwood in the 1990s to create a system of NGOs, contractors, and universities that are the principal implementers. Because when we went through governments for 40 years in aid, budget support is not new. We did it for 40 years. That was the principal mechanism, host-country procurement. Why didn't it work? Well, because the Congress and the regulators said, we want the money dispersed immediately, we want every dollar accounted for, we want no corruption in the system, and we want measurable results for everything. Do you think that Burundi or the Congo or Haiti or Peru is going to produce this kind of measurement and these kind of levels of accountability? We can't even do it in domestic agencies in the United States. If we can't do it domestically in the United States, why are we demanding developing countries do this stuff? The cost is enormous, by the way. People ask why the overhead rates are so high.
That's a very good question, Andrew.
The overhead rates are high because of this regulatory structure.
Andrew, but perhaps you could share. You've proposed.
How do you really feel, Andrew?
Yeah,
Let us know.
I don't want to give anybody the impression that I have any opinions.
Andrew, but you have a suggested way for us to get out of this.
Yeah, I do have a suggestion. And I suggest this, okay? Some people watch, we could never do away with this overburdened system. Let's try an experiment. 5 years, 5 missions. And this is a conservative idea. The conservative movement in the United States came up with the idea of charter schools, which did exactly the same thing. We got rid of all the education rules and the unions and all that stuff. We have charter schools across the country now. Why are they proliferating? Because they're working, okay? Why don't we have charter missions? 5 charter missions for 5 years. We establish baseline, no earmarks from Congress. The mission director makes all the decisions. No interference by the State Department. OMB, you can see how much money you're sending in, obviously. You establish baselines in the area that you want to do the work in. No reporting for 5 years. At the end of the 5 years, you do what is called an impact evaluation. No measurable indicators. Go ask the people you're supposed to help whether after 5 years there's been an improvement in the area you're working in. Peter used to do very good measurable indicators, not measurable indicators, impact evaluations through CDI. I don't know why we abolished them, actually. They're the gold plate. I was told at the the OECD in Paris, they said CDIE was the best evaluation unit in the entire development community. And you don't have it anymore? I said, I don't know what happened, but it's gone. Okay. So we do.
Raj has some.
Let me just
has
finish
some
with
now.
this idea, okay? five missions, and we just simply measure the end of the program. Highly decentralized, and see what happens. The World Bank did this. Because the World Bank is the only aid agency over-regulated more than AID is. You know what they found? There was no deterioration in accountability in the World Bank when they finished this experiment, okay? And there was an improvement in the quality of the program. People think this infrastructure is improving. It's not improving the program. It's a burden for all the partner organizations. For the host country, it's a burden. No one understands why the system exists the way it is, and none of these regulators are talking to each other so that they're not. We had 3 audits simultaneously by 3 different federal agencies of our capacity building in Iraq. Why do you need 3 3 audits of the same thing in the same country at the same time? What's the rationale for that?
Okay, Andrew, thank you for that. I think we need to shift gears, and I think I want to turn to the world outside the Ronald Reagan building, because I think we'll have a chance to come back to some of the.
How about
issues.
outside Washington?
Or how about outside Washington even? Exactly. I think. But first, and that's an appropriate way to segue into our video message from Brian Atwood. Brian Atwood couldn't be with us today. He really wanted to be with us. We have a longer video clip of an interview that we did with him on our website at csis.org. We're going to play a 3-minute clip. We asked him 4 questions. The one I've selected here is the following, and then I'm going to restate it for the group because I think it'll make very interesting television, I suspect. The question is about, as many of you know, Brian Atwood is now, in essence, he's the chair of the Development Assistance Committee at the OECD. In addition to having been the former aid administrator, being chair of the Development Assistance Committee is like being commissioner of Major League Baseball of International Development. And so it's an very important role. And every 4 years they do peer reviews of foreign assistance programs. And the U.S. government just had its peer review. And one of the findings, not surprisingly, is there's a large proliferation of agencies that do development work. And so I asked the question to Brian Atwood, well, how do we respond to the fact that there are over 20 agencies working on international development in the U.S. system? And this is his answer.
Let me start by saying that I'm sorry that I can't be with all of you today, especially my colleagues, the former administrators, and Raj Shah, the current administrator. These are all good friends, and I think we have a lot in common. Well, this is a major challenge for the United States. It's a major challenge for development in the world generally. It's the challenge of fragmentation. It's the challenge of not being able to respond to country ownership when that capacity exists. When a country puts together a strategy, we should be responsive to that by aligning our resources with that strategy and helping to measure results right there at the country level. This becomes very difficult for the United States given the number of agencies and departments that are engaged in development work. We've got to fix this. Now, I really respect the work that has been done both at the White House and the State Department in trying to bring other departments and agencies into a more coordinated program. But I really think we should go back to the day Peter McPherson remembers well, when you couldn't spend money overseas on development unless USAID signed off on it. Today, USAID spends only about half the resources that are made available for development work overseas. That's where the expertise lies. That's where I think the coordination point should be. Now, there are some other very good programs. Our peer review cited the Millennium Challenge Corporation as being an ideal program because it responds to country ownership. I commend Gail Smith and the White House team that tries to coordinate these things under the Presidential Review Memorandum. And I think that the real premium has to be on coordination at the country level. That means the country team has to work very closely together, but that means, it seems to me, that USAID missions need to take the lead, working with other departments to make sure that we are aligning our resources and our strategies with the country strategies.
Okay.
Let me start by saying that I'm sorry that I can't.
Can you stop the? Sorry about that. So let me ask how folks really feel about this, and I think let me ask. So there's been the good news is that development has risen on the agenda here in Washington. The bad news is perhaps for AID that I don't know, 20 agencies up from 4 when we put together the Foreign Assistance Act in 1961 have gotten into the development business. So I guess the question is, how do you coordinate that? So why don't I start first with Mr. McPherson, and then I'll ask folks to respond. Mr. McPherson?
You can't reverse the involvement of all the departments and agencies, in my view. It's come about because every agency and department has international interests in ways they didn't in 1960 or even 1980. So it's not going to change their involvement. The question is, how can you pull together some coherence in this? Now, Andrew and Brian and I wrote an article for Foreign Affairs that came out just before the new administration took office, in which we suggested there might be something co-chaired by the AID administrator and by a senior person in the National Security Council that would be a forum to bring issues, such as various White Houses have had forums for economic policy. I still think a structure like that is reasonable. I think the whole of government effort that Raju and I have been talking about so much with Feed the Future, that's using OSTP and other means. That's a practical option to begin to pull together this and help some major sectors. I think we have to start with the idea, though, that we can't go back to 1980 on this. It's just the world.
Or 1961.
Or 1961. The world is too changed. A bigger issue, which you'll probably talk about, is what do you do with coordination with DOD, and that's a whole separate set of questions.
So let me ask Ms. Fore to answer that question. How do we put the genie back in the bottle? Do we get our bat and ball back anytime soon? What happens to AID in this system?
Well, I'm with Peter that you can't put the genie back in the bottle. There are more than 30 agencies that are working out overseas. But when I was administrator, I carried a second hat, that of the Director of Foreign Assistance. And I am absolutely sympathetic with Andrew's point that what has happened is it's an unwieldy structure. So I would go deeper than Peter. I would try to cut and streamline how we operate. It is very difficult to operate, and we are not getting the best out of our system. Raj has begun to make some major improvements on procurement, but maybe, Dan, it's time for CSIS with Hill members and with administration and others. There's some great minds in the room here and in the USAID building to really rethink this, as sort of a blue ribbon commission that really gets to major change so that we as America can gather all of our programs. When you are visiting a country, they are bemused, confused by all of the agencies that are operating in their country from just the US government. And then you add all of the other development agencies in the country that are from other country governments. And then you add in all of our partners in business and private organizations, and it is overwhelming for a country to organize, corral, focus them on their development program. So to achieve what Brian is talking about, I think we need a much deeper, cleaner approach, and we need to do it as soon as possible.
Dr. Shah, I'm going to give you the next word on this, please.
Well, I think that I agree with all of these insights, and I would highlight 3 things that I think we can do that we're trying to do aggressively and seek everybody's partnership. I see some of our important partners from the Hill and our partner community here as well, and other agencies. The first is inclusive leadership. You know, we don't want to put genies back in the bottle. In fact, we want more genies out of the bottle. We want the military community, the corporate community, the faith-based community, any institution in this country that has value to offer to achieving development results on the ground. We want you engaged, we want you engaged actively, and we want to welcome that engagement. And that is a mindset that we need to have in order to be successful in a much more diverse and much more decentralized development environment. Keep in mind, every industry on the planet is more diverse than decentralized as billions of people kind of enter a more global workforce. The second is we need better processes that do all of the things you've heard today. So we need to reintroduce that concept of being the world's best evaluation agency, bar none. And I actually believe we have the best policy. I think it's been validated by independent third parties. And I think you'll see in just the course of the next year what you've already seen, which is hundreds of high-quality evaluations come out of the woodwork, meet a set of standards, and represent a knowledge base that's accessible and transformational in terms of the sheer amount of learning, experimentation, and insight from it. I think we need a procurement system that is light and fast and that moves a significant percentage of our resources from high-cost mechanisms to low-cost, more sustainable mechanisms. And we need to introduce the capacity to do it. We're moving heavily in that direction, but in a responsible way. And it's the days of doing blank checks for governments, over. The days of doing blank checks for contractors, also over. The days of doing blank checks for anybody, even NGO partners, anyone, no matter how great they are, nobody gets a blank check anymore. That just is the reality. And we need to have light, effective ways of not doing blank checks and of doing results-oriented development. We will, by the end of next year, have 30-some missions on the way to having every mission having a 5-year country development cooperation strategy. That strategy needs to be inclusive of what MCC is doing in that country, what the Peace Corps is doing in that country, what anybody trying to achieve development results is contributing. And I want to highlight Ghana and Tanzania in their Feed the Future programs that are setting the tone for how that needs to happen. But we can do all of this, we can get it all done within the next year at a level of sophistication and visibility so that we're seen as living up to inclusive leadership and really using our expertise to drive strategy for a range of partners. And then the final point I'd make is real innovation. You know, we're not the only people that don't do country coordination well. You know, if you've ever been to a country coordination meeting on anything, you know, they're basically characterized by having usually the wrong people at the table because the people out in the field are not there. They're out in the field doing work. They tend to be a little boring. I don't know if you guys have experienced that, but you know, they're just tough to sit through, and they tend not to work at the end of the day to drive real coordination. The truth is, today we have the ability to spatially visualize where all development activities are, and we can build. We're in the process of building a Salesforce.com-based cloud system that will essentially map all USAID programs and projects. Once we have that, and any American, one around the world can go to Google Maps and flip through and see where our things are, people are going to rush to be on that system. And those kinds of new tools that change the way we think about how we achieve results are going to overpower, I think, the sort of bureaucratic questions of who's on what committee and how do we do that coordination.
Ms. Fore.
Could I add something to what Raj is saying, all of which is very important. But there's one other change that technology has brought, which is it's put the power in the hands of the people who are in the developing world, which means that if you can access the information on websites, you can do your own development. This is the idea of giving a person a fishing pole so that they can feed themselves for a lifetime. But it's a change in the ability of development to be done And it starts with a person in the developing country, in the field.
Thank you. Mr. Natsios, with your permission, I'm gonna go to the next round of questions, and I'll come back to you on if that's okay.
Sure.
Thank you. Okay. So I want to talk about delivery, business model delivery. I think Mr. Natsios touched on it about the issue of budget support and about how we've moved away from budget support, I think for a number of reasons, about responsiveness, about the perception of possible increased corruption. We moved to a model for a number of different reasons, including operating expenses being cut, of working through a much larger architecture of implementation partners, many of whom are in the room. There's been some increased criticism about the current architecture over the last year or two, some of it coming directly from the administration. There's been sort of an interesting debate among the architecture of implementation community about this, some perceiving this as sort of unfair, gratuitous contractor bashing. Others saying that, some folks saying, well, as long as they get to keep their earmark, it's okay, and it does, you know, and so I think there's been a variety of responses to some of this criticism. At the same time, I think there's been a perception that the current model allows us to have a higher degree of responsiveness, or maybe some perceived ability to protect ourselves from the charges of corruption, which is, I think, is something that's deadly for the development community. So I'm going to start with Mr. McPherson about the issue of what kind of a architecture of implementation should we have for the future, perhaps is a way to put it. What kind of an architecture of implementation of the future should we have, Mr. McPherson?
We should have smaller contracts.
Turn on your microphone.
We should have smaller contracts. The idea of a contractor having $500 million or more pipeline is what that is not. These are good people, and they're in many cases our good friends that we've worked with. So it's not whether they're good or bad people. The question is, who has responsibility for economic development policy? When the contractor is too large, you essentially have delegated out development policy. And that's what happened in many cases. So I think the effort to make the contract smaller, more responsive is good, but is important. But behind that requires an agency with more technically qualified people, which is a lot. That's why we moved to these big contracts, is we didn't have the people to do it directly. So we've got to build that. The administration is working hard at that. And we've got to also figure out how to have the whole system work better and easier. I mean, there are lots of reasons that we did this. And we got to solve these underlying reasons for why we got such big contractors, instead of just saying we're not going to have big contractors.
And we'll come back to NGOs and possibly the possibility of earmarks when we talk about our relationship with Congress in a little bit. And so I want to come back to you about this.
Let me just add something here to this comment, Peter. There's another factor here which is not discussed almost at all.
Yeah.
OMB and the Congressional Oversight Committees and the Inspector General bash AID for going back 20 years for not having sufficient span of control over the number of units they manage. So I kept asking, where are you getting this stuff in the Career Service? Because I said we need to have, I said exactly what you said. They said, we can't do that, Andrew. The regulators are telling us we have too many units that we're supposed to manage per person. You can't have 50 units that one officer manages, according to the oversight agencies. We can say all we want smaller contracts, but unless you change the incentive structure and the orders from the regulator, you simply can't do it. The same people who are bashing AID among the regulators for having too big contracts are the very ones who are not giving us the staff necessary to manage a much larger number of smaller units.
But you got to have enough operating expense money to be
Yeah,
able
exactly,
to do that too.
exactly.
It's an integrated problem is the real point. The thing now doesn't work the way it should.
So,
It's-
but I will say that Henrietta put in place the beginnings of the solution, and I think that's the DLI. And I don't know if you want to speak to what it took, or no, I wasn't there, so you should tell us, how did you make that happen?
It was a pretty
'Cause I
heavy
need to
lift,
take
Ms.
notes.
Fore. Why don't you share a little bit about how we got the DLI started? Because I do think that's certainly a part of it. Is how do we? But I also think I'd ask you also to talk about what does an architecture of implementation look like in the future? What should it look like?
Good, that's just where I want to go.
Yeah.
So the Development Leadership Initiative, we looked at this problem that both Peter and Andrew have been so articulate about, and we knew that we didn't have enough officers, either civil service or foreign service, and both officers who are foreign service nationals in the field as well as foreign service officers. And we talked to both houses of Congress and both sides of the aisle, and we also talked within our own administration, which is sometimes the toughest critic for how you can get your operating expenses and money. And we were able to gather a bipartisan effort, the importance of USAID and staffing, how we would use the people, made strong cases. USAID is an extraordinary agency in that it delivers real benefits at low cost. And many people don't know that in America. And so part of it is an education, but part of it is putting together great programs. And so we managed to turn around our staffing. It changed how we began to look at our workload. I think everyone began to do better quality of work because they could see that people were listening and they were getting help. And it made a difference. And I think it can be done again. Where I wanted to go was, Peter and Andrew are both talking about a procurement system. But if you really think that the future lies with public-private partnerships, I mean, we didn't eradicate polio through just US government funding. We had Rotary International by our side as a partner. We didn't do the Green Revolution just with US government funding. We had extraordinary expertise out of our private sectors. So that if you think of it as a public-private partnership, you want to change these systems into ones that allow you to design from the beginning public-private partnerships that start carrying America's interest. And so to me, there's another side that's very forward-looking, and it's what should these look like in the future? And Raj has really started upon that. We picked up good ideas out of Peter and Andrew's time, and it's all moved along. But that is also a future that's going to be very important. It is not just the US government telling people how development should be done in the field. Those days are gone.
Dr. Shah.
Well, you've heard the answers. I agree. You know, smaller, more responsive, more results-oriented, cheaper, and more sustainable delivery systems that are more accountable to the people they're serving, and that we can evaluate with rigor, with the rigor that this agency created and introduced for this entire field. That's number one. And we're going to, you know, number two is take a hold of the things. You know, Andrew already created the charter school for the future of development. It's the Global Development Alliance. And, you know, it can be light, it can be fast. What amazed me as I looked at and learned about the statistics is how the variability across missions in its application, and just how siloed it had been as a relatively small but totally transformational tool. The same is true of the Development Credit Authority. On all three of those, small responsive delivery mechanisms, the GDA and the DCA, we're going to have every single one of our mission directors come to town in 2 weeks with very clear quantitative targets for how they're making those types of mechanisms the absolute standard for how we work going forward at the mission level using existing mission resources and obligations. When we get through that process, it'll take 3 years because these are 2015 targets. The agency you will see on the other end of that will, I think, be the model of what then and with all due respect, the DFIDs and the others of the world will say, how did they do that? We're going to want to get there. And they're not going to realize we had a 10-year head start because DCA is not new and we have a lot of experience with it. So it's very exciting, and there's a lot that we can do in the context of using what excellence exists within the system and making it the central way that we're working all around the world.
Mr. Natsios, the issue of what kind of an architecture of implementation does AID need for the future?
Well, I always find the debate about this architecture interesting because development theory, virtually all of it, if you have Jeffrey Sachs saying the same thing Bill Easterly says, you have to pay attention because they don't like each other, they don't agree with each other. Both of them say these decisions on architecture should be made in the country, not in Washington. Saying that we should have 50% contracts or 20% judges support in Washington doesn't make any sense to me. The mission directors should be deciding themselves, and that should form what the percentages are because each country is different. There's been a lot of studies done by at the different models of development that South Korea used versus Taiwan versus Chile versus Costa Rica versus Botswana. They're all different. If you try to create standardized architectures, which is what Washington is telling AID to do now, what you're going to do is basically create cookie cutter programs that will not respond to the unique development path that different countries have chosen. I'll just give you one example of this. During the Cold War, we had the most intrusive aid program we've ever had anywhere in the world in South Korea. It's not widely known. They've now declassified CIA cables, not AID cables or State Department, CIA cables. Michael Pillsbury has written a book. Brian Atwood commissioned it. It's taken a long time to write it. Getting this declassified is fascinating. The South Korea miracle was not the World Bank. Okay? It was USAID. The USAID mission director sat in the cabinet meetings, was extremely directive and intrusive. He was almost a dictator. President Park said, if you send any more AID economists to this, I'm going to shoot them. Okay, it's one of the CIA cables. However, if you look at the decisions they made, they were the right decisions. It's the 13th largest economy in the world. It's a functioning parliamentary democracy. It's one of our closest allies in the world. If you look back to see our role, it was very powerful. That would not work in some other countries. It worked very well because South Korea faced an imminent threat from China and from North Korea. And they were willing to make profound changes that threatened elite interests in South because the external threat was so substantial. You wouldn't do that in Botswana. I mean, I wouldn't do it in Ghana. But it worked in the circumstances. That's when the mission directors had a lot of discretion and a lot of power, and they're powerful figures. They're still powerful figures all over the world. We don't realize the effect of our mission directors on America's image in these developing countries. When they took a poll among the biggest news magazine in Ukraine, and they said, who are the 100 most influential people in Ukraine? I went in and I said, the AID mission director's here. The only foreigner on the list was the AID mission director. And we didn't have a huge program. It was
What did the
$60
ambassador
million.
think about that?
Well, I mean, there are little problems. I was in a country in Africa, and the head of state, who I've known for many years, said, what does Sister, I don't want to say the person's name because you'll know who it is immediately, think of this? I said, sister? So I went and said, is the mission director a nun? What's this sister business? He said, well, the president calls anybody who's part of his movement sister or brother. I said, are we part of his movement? He said, he calls the mission director all the time. Is this cabinet minister corrupt? Are they competent? Should I promote this person or not? Is this a good initiative? I need help on this. King Abdullah in Jordan overtly says, whenever I have an issue domestic development, I call the AID mission director immediately in, and I tell him what I want them to do. Actually, that's the kind of development program you want, where the head of state is telling us what he wants us or what she wants us to do. And if you look at the effect of AID in Jordan, it's very powerful. You don't hear King Abdullah bashing AID contractors or NGOs. He talks of them in glowing terms. The countries that bash us the most are Zimbabwe. Robert Mugabe bashes us all the time. He beats up our FSNs. Well, that's a sign of honor.
Andrew, let me stop you there. We need to shift gears. I want to make sure we get to some questions, but I want to press on two more questions for this panel, and then we'll open it up. There's a lot of thoughtful people in the audience. We have to talk about the relationship with Congress. I think that over time, I think the perception in Washington is that the Congress has hamstrung AID with any number of different earmarks and there's some perception that perhaps various interest groups go up to the Hill and ask for an earmark. And perhaps maybe it's not the Congress's job to dictate how much money should go to vitamin A, for example. I'm not sure, maybe that would be something that technical experts might want to take that decision, for example. So perhaps, could we just talk a little bit about how we got to this place? Is this the kind of relationship we want to have with the Congress, and what does a more functional relationship with the Congress look like? I'll start with Mr. McPherson.
Well, this is a lot worse than it was 25 years ago.
Oh, absolutely.
Because
Is your microphone?
yeah, it's on
Okay.
now. It's a lot worse than 25 years ago, because as money got tighter, virtually everybody felt in order to protect themselves, I'm talking about outside groups, they had to fight for their own money. Ag, for example, didn't have an earmark for a number of years, and it became the pot that everybody dipped into to round up their number. That's why the CRISP now have an earmark, in effect. So I do think that this country-based idea is important to deal with earmarks. I would like to have something explicit in the act that says that there's a rebuttable presumption that what a country prefers to be their mix of assistance is what it will be. Rebuttable because sometimes the government, for this and that reason, isn't right. It's really the MCC concept. And I don't think it should just be MCC. I think that concept can be broader. Because the people on those appropriation committee chairs, they're good people. And they're interested in what countries thinks. We find in the Partnership to Counter Poverty in Africa, the most effective advocates are Africans. Much more effective than us here. It's the Africans that can. So country-based efforts is the only way that I think has a chance to deal with earmarks. But it has to be more than just a nice statement. It has to be a presumption, a rebuttable presumption, someplace in the law. And people will thereby allow countries to have a seat at the table, which they currently don't usually.
Let me push you on one, and then I want to get to Ms. Fore and then Dr. Shah on this. But you were around for the 1986 adjustment to the 1961 Foreign Assistance Act. Can you just share a little bit about how that happened and what lessons we might take from that?
Well, we got some changes in there. I think it'd be good to get a new Foreign Assistance Act, but I don't think it's a panacea. I think that we'll just fight over the same territory, and much will be. I think you need to have a few key concepts like this rebuttable presumption thing that I talked about. There's some contract processing things that should be there.
Great. Ms. Fore, could you talk a little bit about our relationship with the Congress?
The only reason that DLI was ever done is because of bipartisan support. So with Nita Lowey across the aisle in the House, it made an enormous difference. But you could see that all of our programs had to be bipartisan, so that Senator Leahy and Senator Lugar helped us immensely. Across the aisles is very important. So how do you get there? When you put the earmarks on top of each other, and there are some very knowledgeable people here who know this well, the hard and the soft earmarks mean that it's greater than the budget that we have. And when you add in the mortgages, it means that when a president wants to make a change and wants to help, let's say after the Arab awakening, you don't have money that you can move. And so as this system, it is either money that is too late, it's too early, it's not coming when it's needed, how it's needed, the type of money is not there when you need it and where you need it. So this whole system is one of, just as Peter said, it's that people feel left out, and so there are earmarks. But if you could pull off the earmarks and instead state your objectives, what you want to accomplish around a country-based program, something that is good for the United States and good for the country, you could accomplish this. When you look at the other agencies that have sprung up with models, so there's an MCC model, and there's a OGAC model, and there's a USAID model, and a TDA, and an XIM, and an OPIC. There are many best practices here, and if you do an assistance rewrite, I would look at the best practices, gather them, coordinate them, and put them together so that America is moving in one streamlined fashion. And you can build on all of Raj's good work, but it's a deeper issue, and it is one in which, if you think about it as partnerships, I think you can get it done, but earmarks are not as helpful as they could be.
One sentence.
Yeah, just
I don't think you're going to get massive change here, but I think you can do some things that could have an impact. I mean, what if we had 10, 15% leeway on the earmarks? What if you had, as was argued, some countries that for which we had an Africa account for a few years that President Reagan personally approved. I remember the meeting where we fought for it and got it, where we had major discretion. Go at this in some pieces. Plug in a country-driven presumption, and you'll make some progress.
let me just
Let me just add one thing to this. This is partially a function of the structure of the American political system. In 1950, there were 24 organized interest groups in Washington. There are 16,000 now. The political parties have declined in power and in importance in the American political system, and the place has been taken by interest groups. The British do not have 16,000 interest groups in London. They have three very powerful parties that aggregate voter interests. Congress is reacting to the dysfunctions in the American political system. It's another subject. It's not just affecting AID, it's affecting the whole federal system. Right. Every federal department is overregulated. All of them have too many earmarks. There's too much micromanagement. There's too much, the oversight is irrational at this point. The federal government basically is paralyzed half the time. By the way, the states aren't run like this. I was Secretary of Administration and Finance in Boston under Governor Cellucci 12 years ago. We didn't have to put up with this in Boston. The state is much better, many of the states are much better run than the federal government. And so we cannot we can't solve this problem with a little agency like AID. They're going to have to deal with this, and that's going to take a major crisis. Maybe the crisis we're in will lead to a rationalization of the Congress. Having us report in AID, the development, to 10 different committees is crazy. It doesn't make any sense.
Mr. Natsios, let me stop you there and just ask. I'm going to ask Dr. Shah and Mr. Natsios this question, then we're going to open it up. I want to talk about the evolving relationship with the U.S. military. And Mr. Natsios, could you just talk very briefly about how the relationship has evolved? And I spend a lot of time talking to folks here in the building, outside of the building, about, okay, how do we balance security and development? Should the military be doing development? Should we have a strong State Department function? Should AID do this? I think you're very familiar with the arguments here, and I'll start with you, Mr. Natsios, and then I'll let Dr. Shah follow.
One of the things I did was to create the office. The last things I did as aide administrator before I left to go to teach at Georgetown was to create the Office of Military Affairs. There was resistance in state, a lot of resistance to us doing that. That's why it took us 4 years to do it. I think it's a very good idea. We hired Tom Balthazar, I think you brought back, to be a career colonel, very, very able man, to be the first head of that office. I had 4-star generals from the regional combatant commands constantly coming in saying, Andrew, would you put people on our staff from your agency? These issues, we don't know how to deal with these issues. We don't want to deal with them. Don Rumsfeld created an order which put development and stabilization in the mission of the whole U.S. military. There is enormous resistance to it. If you read the military journals, they don't want to do this. Military intellectuals say, the more we do that, the less able we're going to be able to defend the country and fight wars. That is not what we do. We want aid to do this. Well, you can't do it unless you put the people senior officers, I don't mean junior officers, senior officers who will be in the regional combatant commands. And I was a lieutenant colonel in the reserves. I was a civil affairs officer. I know how the U.S. military operates. It's very important that the 3Ds understand how each other operate. So I think it was a very important thing. And Raj, you've put emphasis on that, and I think it's very, very important that through Democratic and Republican administrations we do it. I would add that the U.S. military is our best advocate. It's not that Secretary of State's always won aid programs, but to have 4-star generals and the Secretary of Defense call up chairmen, and Bob Gates called up the chairman of committees that had cut our budget in aid, and he said, "What are you doing?" And the committee chairman would say, "Why do you care?" He said, "Because we don't want to do this stuff, and we want aid doing it, and we can't do it if they don't have a budget. And you just cut it."
Dr. Shah, what do you think about the civ-mil relationship?
Well, you know, at first I think, and Secretary Gates said it best, I think, when he said it's cheaper to do development than to send soldiers. And he and his successor, Secretary Panetta, have been very loud and important advocates for our portfolio of work. I do think we've had to rebuild the capacities to be good partners. And we've learned a lot in Iraq and Afghanistan about how to be a better partner in an active conflict. That's a different question than how to be a better partner in, say, the Horn of Africa, where often it's USAID and the humanitarian community that's on the front line of understanding issues of food and water insecurity, migration patterns, and what that can mean for our medium-term security outlook in that context. And it's a different question than the way we're working in Central America to deal with internal crime and conflict related to drug cartels and drug issues. So we have to demonstrate that we can be an effective national security partner across a broad range of different contexts and opportunities, and it's not just in active war zones. I also think as our agency rebuilds many of the capabilities like our budget office, our policy planning capacity, you know, we can do more of building the kind of flexibility, not eradicating the earmarks, but it's notable that SERP doesn't have any of those types of earmarks or restrictions whatsoever. And we can model that a little bit more effectively now that we have certain capabilities again back at USAID. On the policy side, I think there's a huge amount of opportunity for us to really be thoughtful leaders about what are the underlying security challenges that will emanate from water issues in Yemen, or how should we be really thinking about long-term food issues in the Horn of Africa, and what does that mean for our security outlook, and how we're not playing that role in a policy capacity as much as we could and should, so we've been trying to reinvest in our capacities there.
Okay, we're going to take a round of questions World Bank style as opposed to USAID style, which is we will capture 3 questions and give we'll ask folks to take each of these. And so we have 1 microphone. I need to see all the hands so that let's see here. Okay, I'm going to call on the gentleman in the back, Mr. Gayoso. I'm then going to call on this gentleman here, and then I'm going to call on that gentleman. And then we're going to call on this woman here. So there's 4. And they're going to be brief. You're going to introduce yourself, and it's going to be a brief question, right? Thank you.
That's difficult for me. Well, I am a refugee from USAID, 25 years. I had the honor of serving there. And now I'm helping in the DLI recruitment process. 2 things. Michael Gerson recently coined a phrase that I think that we need to remember based on what you talk about family planning. Family planning is pro-life. And that is a message that has to be continuously projected by USAID. Second, during the last Republican debate, every single candidate, including Romney, talked very negatively about AID, some of them asking for abolition of the whole program and the agency. Wouldn't it be a good idea if all of you would sign an op-ed piece for the Post and the Times defending AID with numbers? And
Gentleman next to you. Mr. Gayoso, just in front of you. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm Ed Barber.
We
from
can't hear the questions very well.
So speak up.
Right. Okay. Ed Barber from Good Works International, and before that, 40-odd years with state and treasury departments working with a lot of first-class AID people, including at the end your chief economist, Steve Radlett. My question builds on that one. The popular image of AID and its programs is an agency that's throwing pots of money at corrupt foreign governments. The thread that I see in all of this discussion today is, if I could put it crudely, technical assistance. You are teaching the recipient governments, educating recipient countries in how to run a 21st century economy and polity. That, it seems to me, is the, whether that is agriculture, public health, or in the Treasury, the budget management and so on that I saw. My question to you is, in the form of a comment, is this a way to go in an atmosphere of increasingly constrained budgets? The issue is assistance in how to operate rather than money, transferring money. Thanks.
Thank you. The woman over here, and I recognize the gentleman over here.
Yeah, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Rosemary Sekero. I'm the president of Hope for Tomorrow. I want to thank the United States and especially the USAID for their wonderful support. They have supported Africa for so many years. I knew USAID when I was 7 years. We used to get milk, powdered milk, cheese, and wheat from a nearby Catholic eating. So I've known USAID since I was 7 years. I come from Kenya. What I wanted to ask was, thank you very much for your wonderful presentation. Looking at Africa, I come from Kenya, as I said. Africa is the richest country in the world with greatest resources. With the support of the United States and USAID, Africa has remained to be called poor for the poorest and the third world country. What is the USAID, with all the support the America has given, the US has given with other organizations doing to Africa, while it's being called poor for the poorest? Can they be an implement? Can you do something about that? Then I come to the other question. Now that we have innovative and technology, how can we use that for young people to get this moving other than just baby boomers?
Thank you. Going to have the gentleman here. I'm sorry, we need to, I want to just make sure we get these 4 questions answered. And then I'm hoping the administrators will stick around afterwards for some bilateral questions. We're not going to be able to answer everybody's questions here. Yes.
Thanks. Hi, I'm Mark Peterson from USAID's Office of Science and Technology. And USAID's been around for 50 years. People have talked about reaching the day when development agencies like USAID are no longer needed. I was wondering what you think about whether we're on the path to get there, and if not, what do we need to do to get on that path? I mean, people have also talked about countries and regions being stuck. And so are there new players that need to come to the table, or new ways those players need to interact for us to get there? Okay. Thanks.
Thank you. So I'm going to ask each of the panelists to take any or all of those and respond, but I'd ask that you respond briefly. Mr. McPherson.
Well, I think we're going to get there. When you look at today versus 1960, 1980, just huge improvements in the world. I think that part of getting there is human resources. You know, we had at a peak in the 80s, we had 18,000 long-term trainees here, dramatically fewer in recent years. Human resources and research and development, to me, are critical for the world, and those are the keys to sustainability and moving on.
Ms. Fore.
I think the world has shifted a great deal, and it is no longer a world in which it's going to be countries graduating. It is where parts of a country are poorer than other parts of a country. Sectors, industries are not as prosperous as they could be. And the United States is not as preeminent as it has been. And so our future lies in the international world and with these countries. There are some big engines of growth starting to move, China and India, and the continent of Africa with great growth rates that are going to be extremely important for the future of the United States. So to me, it is going to be more of an issue of Americans being globally educated and knowing how to operate, whether you're at a state government level or whether you're at the federal government level, and that an agency like USAID and the other agencies in Washington gather together and integrate their programs so that it is in the U.S. national interest as well as in the developing country interest. What USAID has helped create in the world is peace and prosperity, and that is an enormous positive that we all take for granted.
Mr. Natsios.
I have argued unsuccessfully that the development community has spent too much time cultivating the left in American politics and not enough the right. The way the aid budget was maintained during the Cold War is we had right-wing Cold War advocates for foreign aid and left-wing for different reasons. It's a coalition. That collapsed when the Cold War ended. We have not recovered from that. One of the problems with this city, it's enormously hostile to the church. It's hostile to the church. Half of the country is very conservative, and its base of support of the Republican Party is the evangelical Pentecostal church and conservative Catholics. You cannot win the presidency as a Republican unless you have half the Catholic vote. Okay? We have not mobilized that community. Do you know the only Republican candidate for president in 2008 who endorsed a doubling of foreign aid? It was not John McCain, a liberal, moderate Republican. It was Huckabee. Why do you think he did that? Because he loved foreign aid. He doesn't understand foreign aid issues, with all due respect. The evangelical church told him if he did not support it, they weren't going to support him. We should stop this hostility to the church. And the second major support in the United States, by the way, these churches have a lot of support in the third world. The church is very powerful in Latin America and in Africa. Have we mobilized them behind the aid budget? We have not done that. You think a congressman makes these decisions just on their own because of what they like or don't like? If you get every pastor and priest and rabbi and mullah in your district calling you saying to do something, you take it. I was a legislator for 12 years. You take it very seriously. Have we mobilized them? Absolutely. And we don't talk to those people. The second group is the military. Most of our troops now have been to Iraq and Afghanistan. My son just came back Saturday from a year in Afghanistan, and he had contact with aid officers. Okay? We get four-star generals to sign off on this. How many four-star generals are going to call their legislator or congressman on this? We need to mobilize the 2 million men and women under arms in the last 10 years to call their congressmen and senators. And how do we do that? Through all of the retired military associations, through the American Legion, the VFW, the ROA. I mean, I was a member of these associations when I was an officer and after I retired. We have not mobilized the mass of military in the United States behind this budget. The only way my party is going to support this, if they get a lot of calls from their district and presidential candidates, if they get a lot of pressure, I can tell you what they're going to do. It's just simple politics.
Dr. Shah, you have the last word.
Well, let me just say I want to say something about Andrew's comment, which I think is spot on. And I think if you look at the track record over 50 years of where we've had growth in our development portfolio or our health portfolio, it has often been deeply motivated by our ties to the uniformed military, by our connectivity with faith and evangelical communities, and with an increasing focus now on the role that corporate America plays. And the reason for that is, of course, because unlike where we were maybe 50 years ago, today, more than ever, those communities recognize, value, and have their own very strong self-interest tied into achieving development and health results in the developing world. Today, most of global growth happens outside of our borders, and the fastest growing countries are the ones where we have aid missions that are deeply connected to all kinds of different partners in that environment. We have a lot to offer to people seeking to tap into that growth in a manner that achieves local development results. From a national security priority, everyone that I talk to in the military fully recognizes that the next potential Afghanistan is the Horn of Africa, Yemen situation, and they want to know what are our thoughts from a development perspective on a stable and secure pathway for that part of the world. And as a basic expression of our moral values, I spent an afternoon at Saddleback Church with Kay Warren. She sends 14,000 congregants a year abroad to engage in development and health activities. and they volunteer in the churches outside of Nairobi that provide 60% of the health care to lower income populations in and around that part of that country. They do that all over the world. If we don't do an effective job, as Andrew put it, of connecting to those communities, we won't have another 50 years. And this is the direction that I think it's going. I think we are working hard to change the way we do business in order to be an absolute best partner to each of those communities in reaching out and expressing American values abroad. And I think the proof is in the pudding. You know, we've seen, there were some questions about 50 years and going out of business in Africa. African countries where we're working are often growing at 7, 8, 9, 10%. Steve Radlett's book, I think, is an excellent exposition of that phenomena. And you've seen the transitions over 50 years. We're transitioning out of 11 countries now that are graduating in Eastern Europe, Latin America, other parts of the world. But the most dramatic transformations and transitions happened when the president of South Korea had a state dinner last week or 2 weeks ago, and where there's now a widespread recognition that USAID's early investments there have helped contribute to an economy that creates hundreds of thousands of jobs at home. So I just hope that we do a good job of carrying forward the legacy of my partners on stage here today. And I want to close by saying thank you to the USAID team watching in the building. I think there's a recognition in the Reagan building, as each of you knows personally, that this work and commitment to this work spans political parties, spans particular time of administration leadership. And I spend a lot of my time hearing about the great things that Peter, Andrew, Henrietta, or Brian have done. And so it's wonderful to have the chance to do this on our 50th.
Please join me in thanking the panelists.